Okay, what I'd like to do is mute you all and give a little talk here. 8 points about skillful understanding that is not really entirely Buddhist, but more compilation of some ideas from Buddhist psychology and also some concepts that I've found have been really helpful for myself and for other people that can be integrated into mindfulness practice. The first concept that we've talked about all along here is that of attachment. Attachment is one of the 3 poisons in Buddhist psychology. So I'll just briefly cover that. And it's also regarded as a hindrance in mindfulness meditation, by the way. And attachment has to do with, being enthralled with the object of your observation, the object of your reality experience. Superficial examples might be being attached to things, shiny new things that you purchase. I think a deeper level, perhaps, attachment can be about clinging on to your own beliefs and opinions about things. What I've noticed, just a little socio-cultural sidebar here, what I've noticed is that to the degree people are feeling fear, we seem to cling more rigidly to our favorite beliefs and opinions. So we can think about that. One way to work with attachments, because I always want to make it pragmatic for us, is to look at, what is the cost of your attachment? For example, if your attachment is to being comfortable at all times and staying on your sofa instead of taking care of your body in a way that, gets you walking, moving, exercising, look at the cost there. Look at the cost there. Exercise, diet, etc. These are big areas. Drugs, alcohol, of course, big areas of attachment. And one way we can work with that is just to inquire in a non-judgmental way about what is the cost? What am I paying? What price am I paying for these indulgences, these attachments? There's a wonderful saying that I've recited over the years. It's by a Taoist philosopher by the name of Wei Wu Wei. And I just learned this morning his true name. That was a pen name. Wei Wu Wei's real name was Terence James Stannis Gray. He was an Irish, English, Oxford-trained Taoist philosopher who passed away in the mid-80s. And he says, why are you unhappy? Why are you unhappy? Because 99.9% of everything you think and of everything you do is for yourself. And there isn't one. So think about that. The greatest attachment, the attachment to this, in his way of thinking about it, this fictional self, this concept of self. There isn't one, but we prop it up with our beliefs, with our opinions, with our self-references. So I like his pithy way of provoking. I found another saying of his I've never encountered before, which I really love. He says, and I quote, "Play your part in the comedy, but don't identify yourself with your role." And that brings me to the idea of identification as another point to cover here this morning. Identification, what is the story that you identify with? Now, I would say all of us, if not most of us, at least most of us, if not all of us, were born into a story that we ourselves did not create. And that is the story or mythology of the family we were born into or grew up with. And we internalize that story, identify with that story. That's not a bad thing. Many stories are beautiful and very supportive. Some stories don't support our well-being, like the story, very universal, of unworthiness. And what happens when we have a midlife crisis or a later life crisis, whatever that might be, or have an illness or some relationship conflict or loss, we get to look into those stories that may not be serving us so well. And so to the degree we identify with any story, really, our perspective is constricted. And so in mindfulness, we can work with seeing the story, but not being lived by the story, if that makes sense. What some psychologists call cognitive diffusion, creating space between you and your story, your thoughts, your beliefs, your perceptions. Mindfulness helps us to see the story. If we're living out a myth, a grand story, for example, you're the hero in a certain drama that's about saving someone, then you will have to enlist other people to support your role, maybe an ally, maybe a foe, and you will have a certain, what we can call, mythic task to accomplish. And that myth and mythic task can have great influence over your life, for better or worse. Let me move on. Another point is that of habituation. Another psychological principle of habituation. In perceptual psychology, habituation has to do with when the senses are presented with an ongoing stimulus, like the sound of a whirling fan above your head, or maybe the computer, as I'm now hearing mine. When your senses are presented with a continuous stimulus, let's use hearing as an example, the mind tends to degrade its perception of the stimulus. In other words, the sound of an overhead fan is not heard over time because the mind blocks it out. It's made that way. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. There's certainly survival value there as well. But I like to think of this as literal and metaphorical, maybe not so metaphorical, in the sense of, to the degree we habitually speak in a certain way, act in a certain way, and think in a certain way, relate in a certain way, I believe we can grow blind to those ways of being. And we continue on, maybe not so skillfully at times. And one way to break out of that habit, of course, mindfulness is the thread that's woven through all of these as an antidote, but also connecting in community, receiving feedback from people we know and trust, and maybe even love, so that we can take a look at ourselves and break the spell of habituation. I came across a wonderful quote from a poem by David White, the contemporary poet, whose work I've treasured for several decades now. In one of his poems, he says, "Alertness is the hidden discipline of familiarity." Alertness is the hidden discipline of familiarity. And I would add, in the context of this talk, mindful alertness, because you can be alert and aware and attentive and still be absorbed and attached. And when mindfulness is there, mindfulness is about knowing, where you are in relationship to what or who you are relating to. So again, mindfulness practice can help break the spell of the familiarity that becomes habitual and degrades our awareness. So this is not a statement against familiarity. Familiarity can be beautiful. And to the degree that we can be really present and attentive, familiarity can help us go deeper with that which, or with whom, we are familiar. especially when we're paying attention in a mindful way. That's all I'll say there. Avoidance and control are two other processes I'll lump together because they often flow or go together. Two important psychological or behavioral principles, that is, in the face of stress and discomfort, human beings often, understandably, try to avoid discomfort or control discomfort. Now, there are some things we can't so easily avoid and control, and that can create, of course, a sense of panic, overwhelm, anxiety, worry. And so mindfulness practice, of course, teaches us to be with discomfort, not to suffer, but to widen our capacity to be with all experiences. Now, I'm not saying to be passive with, placing your hand on a hot iron. Obviously, we need to protect ourselves physically, so there's some caveats there. But often the discomforts are symbolic. Someone says something to you and you feel hurt and affronted, and you withdraw, you contract, maybe you go into your aggression and judgment. Very common. And so to the degree we can be present and accepting of the reality of the situation, not necessarily liking it, then we can be available in our relationships, more available in our relationships to self and to other. Avoidance and control. And, we come by avoidance and control very honestly. Thousands, if not millions of years ago, our ancient ancestors had to avoid predators on a daily, if not hourly basis, had to control certain environmental aspects so that they had, food and shelter to survive. And what they called those ancient ancestors on the savannah of Africa thousands of years ago, who meditated with their eyes closed in a seated position on the land. They called them lunch. They were in danger. And so we come by our neuroses very honestly, looking out for danger behind our back. But often the tiger is really not there. The tiger is in us, our own insecurity, fear, aggression, self-story. Enough about that. I can go on and on about that. Wrapping up soon, another couple concepts. One is that of conditioning, the idea that however we are is the product of our conditioning. And it helps to remember that however the challenging people are in your life is the product of conditioning. Now, to make it pragmatic with regard to working with our own self, our own being, or our own non-self, if you will, if we have an issue with, let's use self-judgment, there are certain conditions that create self-judgment. Think about, what are those conditions? Well, we might say, as a child, I received many negative judgments. Okay, but does that mean we have to be self-judgmental? Of course not. And other conditions are, of course, on the surface, this story we're creating, how we're applying that story to ourselves, how we're buying into the story of self-judgment, and essentially how we're relating to the idea of self-judgment. So look for the conditions that create the experience, especially challenging experience, if we want to dismantle them. And often, for something like self-judgment, for me anyway, it's not that I don't have. I do have self-judgments like so many people. It's looking at the story because it's a cognitive thing. It's a belief. It's a perception. It's a story And so the condition of the story, what is it based on? Well, I could say, well, I received these messages in the past, and that's fine. But knowing that is not going to change the story. In a more immediate, present-centered sense, how I relate to that story is going to help me dismantle it. And one way, which brings us to another concept, is that of disidentification or identification, the other side. That is, we're always identifying with stories, and I did cover that earlier, I recognize, but disidentifying is about naming the experience. For example, instead of saying, I'm not worthy, you could say to yourself, a story of unworthiness is here. Thank you, Maury, for that comment, a chat. Thank you for that contribution. He says, so looking at the story without being attached to the story. Wonderful. Another way of saying it is seeing through the story rather than seeing yourself and others through the story, or from the story, rather. Seeing through the story rather than seeing from the perspective of the story. Yeah. And so a couple other things. One is, and these are all really interdependent, that is another concept is that we tend to attribute causes to external conditions. We say things like, she or he made me angry, or my parents did this, or this person did that to me, and that's why I'm feeling what I'm feeling. Now, I want to be sensitive to the extreme cases of abuse and loss, etc., etc. But at the same time, I would suggest that most of our pains in that regard are formulations, again, that we identify with. So always the mind is often looking for that story that can attribute cause to what our experience is. I've told this story before, but perhaps some of you, I believe, weren't here before. It's very brief, whereby once upon a time, the Creator, Great Spirit, had this happiness that she wanted to share with humanity. And she wanted to hide it somewhere because, happiness is very, very valuable. Didn't want to make it too easy for humans to find it. So one of her advisors said, why don't you hide happiness on the dark side of the moon? Human beings won't find it there. And Great Spirit said, no, I'm not sure about that. I think they'll find it there. Another advisor said, why don't you place happiness at the far reaches of the Milky Way galaxy? Human beings won't find happiness there. Great Spirit pondered for just a moment and said, no, human beings are pretty clever. I don't think they'll find it there. She said, I have a better idea. I will hide happiness inside of the heart of the human being, because that is surely the last place that they will ever look. And so this is really the heart, if you will, one of the heart pieces of mindfulness practice, which is about cultivating wisdom and compassion, that place where happiness, satisfaction resides. And the last thing I want to talk about, which I could talk on and on about, so I'll try to keep it really short, is the concept of the shadow. The shadow. Let me clear my throat. My shadow is attacking me right now. So hopefully not. In psychoanalytic parlance, the shadow in general refers to the unconscious, that which we are just oblivious towards, we are not aware of. In particular, the shadow from Jungian psychoanalytic theory refers to the aspect of our being, using more general terms now, that we do not identify with, that we do not identify with. So, for example, if my identity is largely created around, or one aspect of identity is largely created around being a gentle, kind person, the shadow of gentleness and kindness might be unkindness, might be cruelty. And we will never see our cruelty, aggression, let's say, if we only see ourselves as being uniformly kind. But guess where we tend to see the shadow? Because you can't, by nature of the shadow, you can't see the shadow directly. You know, the joke is if you try to shine a light on a shadow, you'll never find it. But you can track the footprints of your shadow. And how do you track the footprints of your shadow? Think about it. It can arise in meditation, often in dreams, you know, and in relationship to other people. In dreams, you might find yourself being very aggressive and perhaps be frightened by that. That might be a sign, you know, playing with the idea of a shadow. That may be a sign of the shadow at work. Also in our relationships to other people, when we judge other people. How can he be doing this, saying that? Why does she have to X, Y, or Z? Those judgments can provide a footprint for our own insecurity, our own self-judgments. And I'm not making, by the way, friends, the shadow into this, you know, unilaterally, absolutely true thing, because it's just a map. And a map is not the territory that it represents. Just like in the Zen saying, the finger is not the moon. The finger pointing to the moon is not the moon. The map of the shadow is just a framework for understanding aspects of ourselves that we often become blind to through the story we identify with, through our habitual thoughts, speech, and actions, through our attachments, for example. So all of these concepts are just maps. You know, they're not to be taken as literal truths, but they point to experience, and direct experience is much more important than these concepts. But if they help to illuminate some direct experience within you and help to dismantle some of the attachments that get in the way of your satisfaction, that help you to understand yourself with compassion so that you can maintain really a balanced relationship, a loving, harmonious relationship with yourself and others, then the concepts may have some values. Otherwise, they're very intellectualized and quite empty.